Hello, my name is Megan Harris, and thank you for watching my Scholars Day thesis presentation. I chose to do my thesis about the challenges of deaf women in society. As a speech pathology major, I've always been really interested when we learned about deafness, and I was personally interested in deaf culture and women's roles in that from a sociological standpoint. And personal research culminated into the thesis that we have today. Now, I'm going to handle three overarching issues that culminate into challenges of deaf women in society: the treatment of women in deaf culture, the treatment of women in the hearing world, and the treatment of deaf in the hearing world. Now, each of those themes will be woven throughout three parts of my thesis and become the unique difficulties and life experiences of deaf women. So first, we are going to start with deaf history, because history informs identity. But first, some background information. Historically, the deaf were perceived as developmentally disabled. Even if this is not true, they had no legal status and thus could not marry or represent themselves in court or inherit land, money, property. Deaf people were also considered to be both uneducable and incapable of receiving salvation due to an interpretation from St. Augustine based on Romans 10:17. Now, Romans 10:17 says, "For faith comes through hearing, and hearing the word of God." So, according to him, no hearing meant no faith or salvation. Additionally, the prevailing belief at the time was that if a child was born deaf, the parents must have done something wicked beforehand to have a cursed child. So it was common practice to abandon those children by the road as soon as the parents realized they were deaf. Now, this history will primarily focus on the history of deaf education, as it is vital and influential to the development of deaf culture and rights. Now, manualism is the forced translation of sign into spoken language. Now, I should be clear. Sign is its own language. It's not a variation of a spoken modality, and to force it in that way was both impractical and difficult for users and a little prejudicial against sign. But it was the first concerted effort of hearing people to communicate with the deaf. And one of the first people to use it effectively, it was Abbé Charles Michel de l'Épine. Now, he created the first deaf school in 1794 and used manual sign to teach deaf students about academics and religion at a time when that was not thought possible. He devoted his whole life to education of the deaf and was perceived to be a miracle worker. Now, his successor was Abbé Roche-Ambroise Sicard, and he would take his students and do public displays of their abilities, like an early deaf UIL almost. And they were so popular that they led to the development of deaf schools across Europe and America. However, he only got into public displays and deaf education in the first place for fame and social clout. Now, oralism is the teaching of verbal communication to deaf to better interact with the hearing world. It's not actually verbal communication, it's just mouth movements, and it was a little unfair because deaf people had to lip read or see sign or receive sign just to communicate with a hearing partner, but it was considered polite for deaf people to try. But nonetheless, deaf people were still getting an education. And so when the first deaf teacher, Jacob Rodriguez-Perrier, used oralist methods, which were secret and ultimately proved ineffective, but hugely popular at the time. He, however, lost his influence in France because he was an academic rival of L'Épine, and they had bitter debates, but L'Épine was Catholic and Perrier was not, and that won him public favor and royal funding, and so his methods and schooling were popular throughout France. But because of Perrier's personal public displays of his students, oralist methods spread across Europe. The successor to the title of foremost oralist went to Baron Joseph Marie de Girondeau after Perrier's death. Now, Girondeau carefully researched Perrier's methods and even went on to run the school after Sicard's death, but tried to make it a hearing school and would fire deaf teachers for hearing ones and ban sign from classrooms. and he was so disliked that they took legal action and he was forced to repeal both. Deaf education getting to America. Now, Thomas Braidwood was a contemporary of Perrier and was very reputable, and he owned several schools throughout Britain, one of which turned away Gallaudet when he was trying to make his school, and he tried to start the first Oralist school in America but failed. Now, Thomas Gallaudet, that should be a very familiar name if you know anything about deaf culture and history. He went to Europe to learn how to start a deaf school, and after being turned away from Braidwood, he went to learn everything about deaf education from Sicard. He returned and founded the first American school for the deaf in 1817. It was wildly successful and the model for deaf schools to follow for a long time, and his son Edward Gallaudet created the first deaf college, which we now know as Gallaudet University, in 1857. Women's roles in deaf education. At the start of the 19th century, women did not have jobs. They did not work. But as schools became more inclusive of children with disabilities, they were overwhelmed and overcrowded and just taxed on resources. So these understaffed and underfunded schools would save money by hiring women to teach at a third less than what they paid their male counterparts. Now, men were leaving education for more profitable industries, and women were taking their place. So by mid-century, women were in every school in America, including deaf schools. Now, women were credited to be such successful teachers because of maternal instincts and nurturing dispositions that helped them raise their own children, and that apparently justified sending them into schools with little to no technical training. As schools for the deaf were created by women like Harriet Rogers and Sarah Fuller, the manualism versus oralism debate devolved into gender discrimination, with people saying, how dare these women go against what male teachers have set up as principles from their experience. So all female deaf teachers began supporting oralism. And they would start and run schools which provided good education and gained good reputations, and they went to legitimize their field by starting associations, conferences, and academic journals, and it worked. They became the prevailing method for deaf education, and manualism became obsolete. However, once the novelty wore off, men became more willing to enter leadership roles, and by the end of the first decade of the 20th century, gender in faculty was balanced. However, throughout most of that time, women were continually paid a third less than men. I should also point out that oralism is a viable option now because we have hearing technology and therapy and the tools to make that ethical. But at the time, it was just hearing people forcing their language on deaf people. Part 2, Challenges of Deaf Women. First, we are going to start with the historical treatment because the majority of the past bit was mostly men. Now, deaf institutions provided the first real opportunity for mass socialization of deaf children, and school staff and faculty functioned as families and parents. However, all hearing staff saw deaf students as inferior on some level, and therefore any education they received was viewed as an oppressive feat on their part, regardless of quality. Deaf culture has also traditionally had a more conservative view on women than the hearing world and held on to it for longer. So deaf girls were taught social etiquette, homemaking skills, gardening, feminine graces, at a time when hearing girls were even being taught vocational skills for appropriate female jobs. As a result, deaf women had almost no chance of any kind of income or financial independence, and grew up to be dependent on husbands and were expected to marry to fulfill a supporting role. As deaf students graduated and there was this new demographic of well-educated and connected deaf young adults, they formed clubs and associations to continue the social life they started at school. However, in these associations, leadership was exclusively male and women were only allowed in minor roles in local chapters. Even though they were the ones providing refreshments and organizing social activities and maintaining the goings-on of the club, they were limited in leadership and meeting participation. As a response, they formed the Ladies Auxiliary in 1909, and that became a platform for women to go into leadership into state-run deaf organizations. Even though they were exclusive against women, these deaf associations were like a foot forward and a permanent stance of deaf culture as a part of society. Right, salaries and education. Now fast forward a few decades, and this is data from the National Health Interview Survey, and it illustrates the educational attainment between 1972 and 1991 by hearing status and gender. And as you can see in completion of high school and college graduates, for deaf men and women, there was a significant increase in population percentage. This is similar, but for occupational attainment, for white collar, the difference between 1972 and 1991 for both deaf men and women was also significant. So what caused such a drastic change in 2 decades? Well, first, the 70s were wrought with advancements in legislation in favor of human and women's rights, anti-discrimination, anti-segregation legislation. Additionally, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act increased overall deaf education, even though it had the severe drawback of not supporting children in the schools. Parents and administrators would, in order to put them in the least restrictive environment, would just put deaf children and children with disabilities into mainstream classrooms with no support, which is bad for all children with disabilities, but for deaf children, they were in a crowded room and completely isolated. Additionally, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the American with Disabilities Act of 1991, they were anti-discrimination laws, but they had a lot of legal loopholes and were very hard to enforce. And finally, automation decreased blue-collar jobs needed available or were available. Gender segregation. So gender segregation is the funneling of genders into gender acceptable jobs, and that impacts all occupational statuses. Women could enter white collar jobs, but were funneled into female white collar jobs, which had less education and less pay. And men's white collar jobs required more education but paid more. So deaf women's education was enough for them to boost themselves into white collar jobs, but they were only female white collar jobs. And deaf men's education was split evenly between white collar and blue collar, and was not always enough to get them into those higher education male white collar jobs. So instead they would choose the blue collar jobs, and were unable to move forward into white collar or backward into pink collar jobs. Now, I think we all have a pretty good idea of what's been considered traditionally masculine or traditionally feminine jobs, but I just want to really emphasize that it wasn't just a social taboo or it went beyond, oh, who wants a woman doctor, or why would a man go into childcare? It was active social deterrence and interference from people who deviated from gendered occupations. So deaf women rose in vocation and income to be comparable to hearing women, but all women were underpaid across all statuses. And so while these improvements for deaf women are very marked, they seem dramatic in comparison because they were gaining rights and opportunities that others had already been using as tools for success. So the hearing world and men had less margin of growth when analyzed for the use of the same tools of education and hearing jobs. So in conclusion, industries of the job market view and value members of the workforce for their gender first, and then other factors such as disability. Identity development. Now, psychosocial development refers to development of identity and personality, and this is a general graph of stages of development. Erik Erikson created this, and though there are different models with different labels and parameters, this is the general model followed. And James Marcia expanded upon his work by creating a fluid continuum for identity development based on occupations and roles, not just jobs, but roles within family and society, and not just religion and ideologies, but just general beliefs. In a later study, he added that a specific female identity factor to include relationships and interpersonal connections. So there is no sequence to these statuses that you see, and they can be experienced in any order and even multiple ones at the same time. There are different aspects to identity to be committed to, and also it accounts for the variables of changing of occupations, ideologies, relationships. So all the factors for deaf female psychosocial development are similar ones for cognitive, linguistic, and educational development. Biological factors, genetic material, prenatal environment, and fetal development, environmental, socioeconomic status, parent education, quality of home. But the primary factor for psychosocial development of young deaf girls is the parents, communities expectations and attitudes on gender. What is expected and appropriate for little boys, what is expected and appropriate for little girls, and what are the responses or consequences for deviating from that. And also, deaf parents must view their child as intact, not deficient, and expect high achievement and accomplishment from them in order for positive benefits. Those two are overwhelming determinants of future success, both personally and professionally. So parents of deaf children, including of daughters, suddenly had to make big new decisions for their child's future. This can be a problem because 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who might not have a good knowledge base or education on their options. But they have to make big decisions such as deaf schools or mainstream schools. Deaf schools might be far away and expensive, but mainstream schools might be unable or unwilling to accommodate their child's needs. Deciding whether or not to get hearing technology, and if so, how advanced, implementation of ASL, involvement of the child in the family and deaf culture, altering daily routines while trying to have a normal life, and how much of that can be done on family resources are huge issues. Deaf parents of deaf children also have the same issues, but they're more likely to have knowledge about their options, empathy for what their child's going through, and are also more likely to experience judgment or critique from deaf culture. Like I said, with occupation, parents' expectation for high achievement are critical to success, but they experience setbacks based on the three themes that we see: deaf culture's views on what women are capable of, hearing world's view of what women are capable of, and hearing world's view on what the deaf are capable of. Finally, deaf relationships. The hearing status of a deaf person's romantic partner is a huge consideration. If the deaf person is not confident or accepting of their deafness, they might end up with the hearing partner solely to mediate their identity issues. On the other hand, deaf culture has a tendency to put social pressure on deaf marrying deaf. There's nothing wrong with that except for the social pressure part. Finally, there's a consideration of codas. Children of deaf adults. They're more likely to have an ASL background and involvement in the deaf community, and by some generations of deaf culture are seen as the acceptable way to date deaf people. Regardless of hearing status, there needs to be communication about expectations and expectations about communication. If there's a hearing partner, are they going to be the sole interpreter between the deaf person and the hearing world? Everyone needs to make sure that their needs are being met. For a family, in terms of marriage and partnership, obviously goals and priorities need to be synced, but also there needs to be made plans for deaf and hearing children. If two deaf parents have a hearing child, they need to be able to help them with verbal input and linguistic development. And we already spoke about the considerations for deaf children. Finally, couples and families need to determine the amount of involvement and place within deaf culture. Part 3 is the personal accounts of deaf women. As a hearing woman, I can only speak to the challenges of being a woman, and I thought it unfair to just put this forth without including stories from deaf women. So Rebecca Dady was told at age 8 that she was deaf and would never read beyond a 4th grade level. Her parents ignored that and gave her all the tools and opportunities for success. She went on to graduate with her bachelor's and master's degrees and became a professor of ASL and deaf film, a triathlon athlete, and a mother of 3. Rachel Kolb is profoundly deaf and chose to learn verbal communication as a child, and that took the course over 18 years of therapy. She was told that when she was in high school that she should never speak without an interpreter, would never be a rider, or be able to ride horses without help. She was a competitive equestrian at Stanford University, where she graduated with her bachelor's and master's degrees in creative writing, and told her story on a very famous TED Talk. So, without an interpreter. Jackie Roth is a deaf actress who has performed in hearing and deaf theaters on and off Broadway, and most famously was the co-producer of the first documentary on cochlear implants, and this was in 2000 when the FDA changed the implant age from 2 to 1 years old. She is proud to use ASL in her craft, despite of growing up in an oralist New York that shamed her for it, is an advocate for more diverse deaf roles, as well as cooperation within the deaf artist communities. Beth Bart-Beers is a soccer player for the U.S. Deaf Soccer Women's National Team. She was hard of hearing as a child and never knew it, but she lost her hearing completely when she was 22 to semicircular canal dehiscence. She was all of a sudden isolated and chose to turn to her athletic passions to cope. She joined the women's team in 2017, and that was her first encounter with deaf people and ASL, and she's been working really hard ever since then to be able to communicate with her teammates. She made her first friends there and found her identity within that group. She's also represented Team USA in track and field events at Deaf Olympics. Lastly, we have Claudia Gordon and Mariah Nichols. Claudia Gordon was the first female deaf African American to graduate from law school. She lost her hearing at 8 and left her home in Jamaica to avoid discrimination and pursue her education here. She attended Howard University, got her law degree, and went on to work for Homeland Security, the Obama administration, and is now a Sprint executive over phone technology for facilitating and enabling deaf use and communication. Now, Mariah Nichols suffered from a traumatic brain injury from a car accident when she was 4 years old, and those injuries were exacerbated by wrecks later on. From those injuries resulted deafness, auditory processing disorder, child post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. Her parents assumed everything was fine once her scars healed up and because she had no external issues. She tried to ignore her internal issues and do anything to avoid being labeled disabled. However, she entirely changed her perspective once she accepted a job in disability services at UCLA and encountered people with all kinds of disabilities living strong, fulfilled, and happy lives. She is now a counselor and a single mother of 3 children, one with Down syndrome. She also blogs and gives resources for people with TBIs, deafness, APD, PTSD, depression, and Down syndrome. And also writes about the challenges of being a single deaf mother and how her deafness intensifies those challenges by creating hearing and communication obstacles while she's living in a hearing community. So in conclusion, deaf women's experience is multidimensional and is not perfectly encapsulated by my thesis or these women's stories. However, all of them went on to write about facing communication barriers, experiencing isolation, perceived limitations from themselves and others, while also experiencing stereotypes, prejudice, exclusion, and discrimination for their disability and gender. In case it was not clear, deaf people can and do everything we do except hear. And finally, support from family, friends, and loved ones, or the lack thereof, critically shapes their experience, self, and future. Now, hopefully you're asking, how can I help out of compassion? While we do not need to be a great hearing hope. As a hearing individual, the best way to be a friend or ally to deaf women is self-education on deafness, willingness to accommodate environments, putting forth effort into communicating and connecting. If there are deaf people around, don't stare, don't ignore, don't be weird, just be kind. And if and when hearing individuals have power and influence to do so, advocate or initiate inclusion at every level of a business or organization, and promote and ensure women, deaf communities, and people with disabilities are involved and authoritative at every level of decision and policy making, especially when it involves themselves. And that's everything. Here are my sources, and if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you so much for watching my thesis presentation for Scholars Day.